already muted, and we're also recording this video. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your video. I'm going to keep it pretty succinct and direct for the first 30 minutes. We'll go through different food scrap collection techniques and tools, and then we'll start in on everybody's individual questions. Because like I've said before, if you have it, I bet somebody else has had it too. So I'm Zoe, the Rust Belt Riders Residential Services Director. This is, just a silly photo of myself, but it's one of my favorites because all of that soil that you see there used to also be food scraps. So Rust Belt Riders works in a circular fashion where we take everybody's food scraps and create soil and compost with them. I've had 10 years of composting experience, 10 plus, almost 15. And like it says, I've had that much time of messing it up and getting it right as well. So we'll go through what that looks like. Before we really get started, I wanted to share that a lot of this process really boils down to this quote that I recently discovered, but has really resonated with me. And the map is not the territory. So while I will be laying out a quote unquote map of what it could look like for you to collect your food scraps, it's not always exactly replicable in your home. So what works for me and what my tolerances are and what my vision is for how I want my kitchen to look isn't going to be the exact same for you or you or you or you. I also wanted to share, of course, that we're now able to service all of Cleveland with our home pickup services. And I know that we've had quite the issue with our recycling services in Cleveland, but also across, really, I guess it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say the globe, but the United States. So what's compostable today will be compostable in 100 years, and I love that. We're gonna jump right into food storage techniques. Take a quick look at the time here. Okay, so imagine yourself in the place of having just prepared dinner or a breakfast or a lunch or a snack, any kind of food, or prepping your meals for the week, and you've got all this food prepared, but you also have food waste. And so that's where we found ourselves. We're in the kitchen. There's many different kinds of food waste receptacles that you could use to gather your scraps before you take them to your compost pile, your neighbors, or before you bring them to us in our services, our pickup and or drop-off services. We've got your stainless steel container. What you'll see here is each container type and some of its positive and negative traits. So what I like about the stainless steel container, easy to clean, mostly lightweight. It's not made out of plastic. I would venture to say that it's dishwasher safe, though you'll always want to check the brand, what it would, it'll tell you on there. It can sit on your countertop and it's nearly unbreakable. I say nearly because who knows, but lots of things can happen. So then we've got bamboo, a bamboo container, and these containers come in all shapes and sizes, right? They're like, and types and material types. So, and there's a lot of like an aesthetic to it, depending on, like I said, if you care a lot about what you really want featured in your kitchen, or if you're like, nope, just give me a bowl, we'll get to it. So the bamboo type, easy to clean, lightweight, it's not made out of plastic. It will, though, in my experience with bamboo, it has a faster deterioration rate than other material types. Again, it sits on your countertop, but then it may also be prone to holding odors because of the material and its absorbency. So we've got these really nifty guys. They're plastic attachments to your kitchen cabinets, sink, countertop, you know, drawer, right? You could attach them anywhere. There's this one that screws into your cabinet, which I personally have my eye on. And then there's the one that hooks on to an area. I'll get everybody a list of these items and where to find them. But I just wanted to give us all also a visual of what it could look like for you to have an easier time collecting your food scraps in your kitchen. Similar to the bamboo, lightweight, easy to clean, prone to holding odors, but that's really over a long-term period. So I've had my bucket, well, I've had a lot of different buckets, but this bucket that I have right now that I collect my food scraps in, I've had for about 9 months, and I clean it regularly, and there's just ever so slightly the hint of not brand new bucket. That's because I empty it and clean it regularly. So we've got, you know, your standard plastic container. Some have a vent, some don't have a vent. Again, there's a personal choice here on what you want. Easy to clean, lightweight, sits on the countertop, a little more prone to holding odors. But you know, if you clean it regularly, it's gonna be just fine. And then always plastic itself, more easily broken than stainless. And then we've got your ceramic bin. We're getting a little bit more into the ornate, you know, some ceramic bins have the word compost on the side, or this like beautiful blue color. This one happens to be red. It also happens to have this, those aeration dots. So, or holes rather. They look like dots on the screen, but they're holes. It's, you know, ideal. It's not plastic. I like that about it. Can be heavy though, you know, ceramic things are heavy. And so personally, I've never used one of these, but I could imagine that if you have a, you know, if you're holding it over your sink, cleaning it out, it, you know, it may be a little heavy. And then we've got the bucket. So if you are, you know, you're collecting your food scraps and you want to use a countertop bin, you can use a countertop bin, then dump those scraps immediately into your bucket, or, you know, after a few days of collection, a day or two, you can take those scraps and put them right in your bucket. You can also just keep your bucket out in your kitchen, right there, a little bit out of the way, and pop the lid off when you're ready to put your scraps in and put them directly in. I've lived like that in the past. It's not a terrible way to do it. Sometimes there's a great little nook in some kitchens where you can just stick that bucket, and you know, it's really nice and simple. The easier it is to access, the more likely it is that we're going to use it. So I would say that, you know, there have also been times where I've kept my bucket out in my kitchen, but I have always kept the lid off when I'm cooking so that I can just go directly from the counter into the bucket. So some of the perks that we have here, right? The bucket is very versatile. You can immediately dispose of your scraps into it. You can keep it inside or outside. There's no need to purchase new, right? We can find, you know, you may have a bucket in your garage. You may have already purchased a bucket, a Rust Belt Riders bucket, another one. You may have an old bucket. I was going to say from painting, though, you would want to make sure that it's completely cleaned out from, you know, that there's no paint chips in there. You know, you may have worked at a restaurant and sometimes restaurants get pickles in 5-gallon buckets. Frequently what I've found, you could find yourself an old pickle bucket to collect your scraps in. Again, there's immediate cleanup after cooking if you're keeping your bucket in your kitchen, and there is an easy transfer to your pile or our bins, because you can take this bucket and dump it right in. It's a great handle. You can throw the lid on. You can put it in the back of your car. Nothing's happening with that. So we're going to go to the next slide here. Oops, I'm going to let these folks in. Got a few folks who just popped in through the waiting room. Welcome, everybody. And aha, the age-old question that I always get with folks that sign up for our services, or even those that we talk with at farmers markets. Well, that's great, Zoe. This 5-gallon bucket seems kind of big. Where am I going to keep it? A 5-gallon bucket actually fits pretty conveniently under your kitchen sink if you have a large enough cabinet. Caveat. You can keep it though outside, inside, in your kitchen, in your pantry, under your kitchen sink. Like I said, right next to maybe your countertop or your stove or your island, wherever you do the most chopping of things. And but you'll always, always, always want to choose a cool, dark place to store your bucket. So when you are thinking about it, if you're going to have food scraps in this bucket that has a lid on it, you're not going to want it to bake in the sun. Trust me, I've let mine bake in the sun. I've let mine sit in my car. I've let mine sit in the back of a truck. I have forgotten about it and left and gone out of town, and it's been there. Quite an obedient bucket, but it really isn't the best thing to let it sit in like the hot sun. So, like I said, always choose a cool, dark place to keep your bucket, and you'll be just fine. There's the transfer bowl, like I've mentioned in the past. What's great about this is that you, like the bucket, you don't need to purchase something new, immediate cleanup up after cooking, and you can just grab any bowl, popcorn bowl, a mixing bowl, you know, depending on your size. There's Claire's bowl, right? Mine's in my sink over there. You can just grab it, stick your eggshells, coffee grounds, whatever it may be in your small bowl. And then, you know, say you're in a rush, you're just working, the things go in the bowl, you put them in your bucket when you can, or in your larger bin when you can. And then there's the freezer method for collecting these things. So if you don't have the space for a countertop bin, you don't want to buy anything new, you want to reuse what you can, and you really, really, really are really hesitant about odors, and you have the freezer space. So these are intimate pictures here of the inside of my freezer. I took them just for you. We've got 2 methods shown, but you can, again, play and explore and figure out a way that's going to work. In the past, I have used these salad containers. I've gotten, you know, field greens or spinach or something in this larger container. And I thought, boy, what am I going to do with this plastic container? It's so big. I can sort of recycle it. Do I really trust that? And I can, so I said, okay, fine. I'm going to use it to collect my food scraps in. Well, then my food scraps, you know, it was a warm summer day. And I was like, oh, I got to get these food scraps out. I don't have time to take it to the compost pile. So I stuck it in my freezer. And I found that, you know, you can really, it's a great utilization of, I mean, personally for me, my freezer space, because I just put it in there, and when it gets full, I take it out. There's zero smell. I've also, as you can see, collected food scraps in a paper bag in my freezer. So I have, you know, they've been non-wet items are best. If you're gonna use a paper bag, you're not gonna want to put, you know, like a bunch of soup in the paper bag in your freezer. It's probably gonna leak through the paper bag and soak out into little bits of your freezer before it can get frozen together. So that is, you know, what those are 2 methods if you have the space for it. If you don't have the space for it, it's a little bit rough. If you really want to go for it, you can try to organize your freezer. I'll talk more about separating out materials in a little bit. Admit Elizabeth Drake. Welcome, Elizabeth, into the from the waiting room. Let's see. So we're going to go on from the freezer, right? No cleaning of any compostable scrap buckets is necessary. 0 odors. It's out of sight. However, it does take up that valuable space, or as I said, the valuable popsicle space in your freezer. Oh yes, this way. So Many of these composting containers that you saw are adapted to have a charcoal filter that fits in the top of them. And that, again, it can help prevent, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to get this composting bin for the side of my sink, but I think it's going to smell, and I've never done this before. I'm going to try a charcoal filter. If you're going to spend a little bit more money on the charcoal filters, and they do need replaced about twice a month, you're going to want to replace that at least once a month, possibly twice, depending on the nature of the material that you put in the bin. So to filter, not to filter, it's up to you. I've never used a charcoal filter. Claire has used a charcoal filter. We were talking about it before because I said, I've never used a charcoal filter. I imagined that it would help. And she said, well, I have used a charcoal filter. So we can have a direct experience. If you want to hear more about that in the question time. Now, again, to bag or not to bag. So all of the bin types that I just went through pretty quickly, you'll get a copy of this presentation at the end so you can look through it again. But all of the bin types can accommodate a bag. They can all be lined if you want to do that. It is a few things about the bag. If you're gonna participate in the Rust Belt Riders services, pickup or drop off, you'll want to use a BPI certified bag. So BPI is a certification that compostable items, what we call compostable serviceware or compostable bags, can receive if they have 0 plastics in them. They have to have 0 trace plastics in order for them to be BPI certified, and that's the certification we use. Bags can be helpful in keeping your bucket or your transfer container cleaner after you make that initial dump. So if you are, you know, looking to not have to clean so much, or if you're on the run and you're like, this isn't happening, the bag's going to keep your container a little bit cleaner. Additionally, if smells are really a deterrent for you, but you really want to participate in composting, you can use a smaller bag, tie up your food scraps, put them in a bucket, and close the bucket lid. Cool, dry, dark place. You're not going to have, I don't want to say you're not going to have any odors because I can't guarantee that. You're going to have very, very few odors, especially if it's tied up in a bag. Now, if you're going to use a bucket or even a smaller container, you don't have to use a compostable bag. In fact, you can use a paper bag from the grocery store, or, you know, that you might get just like one of the small paper bags that we get sometimes. You can use that to line your bucket or bin, no problem. So this smell goods versus smell not so goods has been a huge transformation personally for me in the way that I approach food scrap storage prior to removal. So that's really what we've got. We've got food scrap storage, you know, and removal before the composting process actually happens. So this here is a picture, excuse me. This is a picture of what I would call smell goods. We've got some flowers, some orange peels, lettuce, a lime. I see coffee grounds, an avocado pit, that may be a tea bag. All of these things are relatively fresh, not extra quote unquote juicy or gloopy. I think orange peels smell pretty good. They have like natural smelling odors. So this is the type of item that I would put immediately in my countertop bin or bowl with the lid on or off and have no qualms about finishing my cooking for the evening, closing it up, letting it go overnight, waking up the next morning, making another coffee, bit of coffee or eggs or tea or whatever your breakfast may be, and then taking the material out. These are what I would call smell goods. These are what I would call smell not so goods. So I came up with this list off the top of my head. We've got on the smell not so good list, stinky leftovers, goopy sauce, think like Alfredo sauce or pasta sauce. You could have, a stew, yogurt, gravy, meat, rotten fruit, like really juicy, rotten strawberries or an apple that's gone bad that has a soft spot in it, moldy vegetables like the carrot, like when you like accidentally lose that carrot in the bottom of your crisper and it sort of liquefies and molds. I've been there. Moldy muffins, I added fish, definitely, and rinds. And so what I'm really getting at here is these are the items that I would either put in my bucket right away and close the lid, or I would put in my freezer because you're going to cut the smell immediately. I'm not going to lie and say that, sometimes food scrap collection does have an odor, because if we have an old piece of fish or some old chicken that has gone bad in our refrigerator, like it naturally has an odor. But there are ways to separate those things out from your smell goods so that you can have a more pleasant experience collecting the food scraps themselves. So we can get more into the details there, but if you start, handling the material, you'll start to sort of learn the smell goods from the not so smell goods just based on your own intuition. I would really encourage you all to trust that. Oopsies, went too fast there. So this is really important, especially for folks who have members of their household that you're like trying to convince that composting is a good idea. I have found, even for myself, that I have a much more pleasant experience transferring the material from my container to our bin, because I live in an apartment in Cleveland Heights and I don't get to have a compost pile in my backyard. I use the Rust Belt Riders drop-off service. And even, I don't love dumping out a bucket of extra like gnarly smelling rotten chicken. That's actually, I had some chicken meat that went bad in my refrigerator. I feel really bad about it, but it's okay. I'm gonna compost it. But it's not like, ooh, I can't wait to dump out this like gross food. It's like, no, I'm gonna put this chicken meat in my freezer. And then on my dump day, or on the day that I know I'm gonna be able to get to that bin right away, that's when I do the transfer. So I've got the smell goods, they've been going in my bucket, no problem. And I've got the not so smell goods in my freezer to, take out on dump day. I do have this bullet point here, live with the consequences, because, sometimes I personally have had to live with the consequences of not, or of letting my items go too long. If you just really let them go too long, I'm gonna have some odors. So it's about, weekly maintenance, but it's also, I know I say it's not too complicated. So I wanted to make sure that again, you can see a perfect example here of smell goods versus maybe smell not so goods if they sat a really long time. So I wanted to just, talk about where naturally occurring odors come from. And it's just a part of their decomposition process. So really, what you want out of a really healthy compost pile is to like reach in and grab the compost and smell that like nice, rich, earthy smell, because that is also part of the decomposition process. And that's how you know when your pile is healthy. But when you start to have this odor that is maybe sharp or astringent, or maybe a little, just like a little gaggy, it's when the material has sat for far too long in an environment with zero oxygen, and it's gone aerobic. So when there's, there's no oxygen in the anaerobic, when there's no oxygen in the system, you're going to have a much more odorous pile or bucket. And that's why I mentioned earlier, I would encourage you to leave the bucket lid slightly ajar or off, if that's an option, when you put your smell goods in it. So, and you're sequestering your smell not so goods in your freezer or refrigerator. When there's oxygen flowing through the pile, you're going to have a much more pleasant, or not the pile, excuse me, when there's oxygen at least near the bucket flowing over the top of it, you're going to have a much more pleasant experience. But if that's not an option, it can still be completely fine, especially if that bucket is in a cool, dark place. Okay, where are we at here? All right, let's see. How did I do? We're a little early, but that's okay. And I, wanted you to know, this is really a food scrap collection discussion. So I wanted you to know that, and this is like my colloquial language coming through, like, here's the real deal, just try. Like, it's really okay to try and stop and try and stop and put your food scraps in a bucket and put your food scraps in a trash can. You don't have to be perfect for it. We make mistakes, learn, and eventually get it right. But there's no getting it right, and there's no learning, there's no making mistakes if we don't just try. So I really encourage everybody to just start. You could start with your apple cores, banana peels, and coffee grounds and eggshells. You could just start there and say, okay, well, maybe I'll add this old salad that I have, or wow, look, I had a birthday party for my kids and there's all this extra cake, or nobody touched the fruit salad and it's going bad. And as you start to practice and get comfortable with those things that feel safe to you, I would definitely encourage you then to keep going on. So I have my contact information here. You can call us anytime to talk about anything, email us anytime to talk about anything. That's what I've got for you. Claire, whenever you're ready, I'm ready for questions. So for anybody that came new, quickly before we jump into questions, we're recording this so that we can send it out to anybody, to everybody who's on tonight, but also to anybody else who wants it. And so if you don't want to be recorded, turn off your video, please. And if you have questions that we're not getting to, stick them in the chat so that we can make sure that we get to everything.
Thanks, Zoe.
You bet.
I have a comment here from Joni. She said, my bin doesn't smell. I keep it on my counter and transfer the contents to my RBR bucket when it fills up every 2 days usually. I clean it out once per week. No stinkiness, which is great to hear.
Awesome, Joni. Thank you. I'm really happy to hear that. I think cleaning it out once per week is definitely a great thing to do, and transferring it to your larger bucket makes a ton of sense.
Awesome. And then she also had a question, how important is it for our scraps to be inside the paper liner in our RBR buckets? Sometimes it gets a little wet and starts to collapse a bit. That means that I eventually can't really fill my bucket to capacity.
Yeah, it's not important. If the bag, so what Joni is asking, for those of you who don't participate in the Rust Belt Riders pickup service, like Joni and a few others do, I saw a few folks jump on the call. We used to line our buckets, you can see here, with a compostable bag. We now line our buckets with a paper bag. We were doing some product experimentation, decided to go with the paper bag. The paper bag helps absorb some moisture. It's also actually keeps the bucket cleaner on our end of things. So when we dump out the bucket, we were finding that compostable bag was sticking a lot to the inside of the bucket, especially the bottom part where it got really wet. So that's part of our reasoning for switching over to the paper bag. Joni, to answer your question specifically, if it gets wet and crumples and stuff falls on the outside of it, don't worry about it. Still feel free, it's not important for us that all the scraps are in that paper baggie. You can let them go above the paper bag or on the sides of it.
All right, thank you. This one is from Mariana. She asked, what are things to consider, watch out for when setting up a neighborhood composting system on an empty lot?
Mm.
I would say contamination.
Yeah, contamination and the city is my second answer. Definitely contamination. So things that you're going to want to think about, Mariana, are what your carbon source is. So in order to have a really healthy compost pile, you really need adequate amounts of carbon. You cannot just put in food scraps and think that it will magically compost. There's actually, I was reviewing this earlier, there are 5, to myself, not in the presentation, so it's new to everybody. There are 5 key components of a compost pile. There's a nitrogen source, which we use, food scraps. There's a carbon source, which could be wood chips, straw, wood shavings, bulk shredded paper, leaves. Then there's oxygen and moisture. What was the 5th one? Definitely those 4. Nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and moisture. So the nitrogen and carbon come from the inputs of the material. The oxygen comes from turning the pile, and the moisture comes from the rain or a hose or buckets of water, moisture, H2O, in any form. It's really important to have a healthy balance of those things in order to keep your compost pile working well. I would also dissuade you from putting in any animal products or leftover foods in a community pile. You will be attracting rats, possums, skunks, and raccoons if you're putting in leftovers, meat, and dairy, especially. You can prevent those animals from coming even into your backyard pile by using extra carbon. So if you put in, let's say, 1 5-gallon bucket full of food scraps, I would put in 3 5-gallon buckets full of carbon and keep it nice and covered with the carbon.
And she also asked what the pros and cons of buying compost were.
Oh, sure. So that's a great question. Well, the con is that it costs money. The first one, in my opinion. The pro is that you immediately have a garden bed available. Bam, you lay it down. There's no waiting. There's no work. Somebody comes and drops it off. Bingo, you have your garden bed immediately. Another pro of buying compost is that if you buy living compost, and I've done this before with other places where I've established compost piles, if you buy living compost, meaning that the compost has been tested under a microscope to have living microorganisms in it, and you can see the macroorganisms like roly-poly bugs and worms, it will jumpstart your compost pile to make sure that those microorganisms are working the future inputs that you have. So instead of starting from absolute scratch, you can jumpstart a pile with that. What actually does the composting, and I think this is fascinating, what actually breaks down the food scraps are the microorganisms. So when they're moving around and creating friction and eating the inputs, the carbon and the nitrogens that you're putting in there, the oxygen, of course, they need it to move around. And the moisture, they need that to be able to move around as well. They're breaking that material down and you can't even see it until it's a finished pile. So that's pretty neat.
Okay. And here's a question from Abby. Do we need to peel off produce stickers from our bananas or apples?
That's such a great question, Abby. Yes, we would really, really, really like it if you would peel off produce stickers from your bananas or apples. If you toss one in and you happen to forget, like, it's okay. But yes, I would very much so prefer that those come off.
And Marilyn asked, I don't put any dairy, meat, or fish in my home compost pile, but can Rust Belt riders accept all these things? And what about compatible utensils and plates?
Gotcha. So Marilyn, yes, Rust Belt riders can accept dairy, meat, fish, and bones, which is part of what makes it unique in comparison to a home compost pile. That specifically is because our piles are maintained to a certain temperature to make sure to kill off any weeds, seeds, or pathogens. Really important that that's like very, very, very important to us to make sure that you're getting a safe product. And what was the second part of the question, Claire?
Compatible
Ah,
utensils and plates.
sure. So things that say this is so great because the things that say this item is 100% compostable or this item will biodegrade or 100% natural. There's a lot of greenwashing involved with those products where, you know, it makes it look more environmentally friendly than it is. And in order for the item to be acceptable in our system, it has to say BPI certified. So Marilyn, if you're working your home pile and you think, oh, I need a little bit, you know, I have this paper plate or this takeout container that feels like paper, go ahead and rip that up and toss it in your home pile. That's what I would do if I had a home pile. I think that's perfectly fine. But if you are putting something in the Rust Belt Riders system that it's like this plastic feely stuff, but it says compostable, it has to also be a BPI certified product.
Yeah, those plastic coatings can be sneaky.
I know.
All right, this one is from Sarah. What if produce in your pail is moldy? Is that okay to add to a compost bin?
You bet, Sarah. It's okay. The mold is just getting it going. No problem. It's not going to mess. Mold will, there's no absolutes in life, right? Like if the whole pile was completely moldy, it still wouldn't mess it up. There would just be more work needed to fix it. So I can confidently say that a little bit of mold or even an entire, if the whole bread package is completely covered in mold, something like that, you can still include it in the bin. And in fact, it's best to include it in a compost pile rather than throwing it away. You're not going to mess up the system with a moldy apple in our compost bins or your backyard bins.
And we had another Sarah asking about pistachio shells and paper towels in their compost.
Does it just say in their compost?
It says, can you compost pistachio shells? Can we put paper towels in the compost for RBR?
Great. Thank you. Yes. And yes. Now the paper towels are a caveat. There's a caveat with those paper towels. I'm going to tell you very specifically. The pistachio shells, yes, no problem. Avocado pits, peach pits, you know, peanut shells, all of that. Yes, those are all food adjacent items. It's a term that I've come up with. Because I wouldn't recommend that you eat it, but it's associated with food, so you can add it. The paper towels, if they've been used to clean up a spill that is a natural spill like water, or you've used a paper towel as a napkin for dinner and you're wiping your plate into your compost pile, go ahead and include that paper towel. We are not a recycling company, so we don't want tons of bulk paper towels. We also would like the brown paper towels in preference to the white bleached ones. The brown ones are completely natural. So there's no chemicals used to make them white. We prefer that. And in very subtle moderation. So you're draining out some strawberries that you've just washed. Toss the paper towel in. They might even have the strawberry greens in them, you know. But your pet has accidentally urinated on the rug and you used a bunch of paper towels to clean it up. We do not want those. So, and if you're wondering about it and you're like, I got this extra thing, always call and ask us. Thanks.
Wonderful.
And thanks, Sarah.
Katie asked, wouldn't food eventually mold after throwing it on a compost pile before breaking down?
Mm, yes, if you did not mix that food in. So what we do and what I always recommend to others, excuse me here, is that you add your food scraps and then you immediately, I'm doing this right with my hands, but you mix it in so that it's touching a carbon source. Yeah, sometimes it molds. That's okay. Sometimes, because you're adding oxygen to your pile by mixing it up, you're opening it up so that it's not that warm, dank environment where mold thrives. You're constantly turning it. I guess yes and no, and it's okay.
Wonderful. Jacqueline asks, can you go into more detail on composting cooked foods, like if you've used oil to cook chicken?
Sure. So I'm going to answer this in terms of first in terms of composting in the Rust Belt Riders system. If you're participating in our pickup or drop off programs and you use some oil to cook with, totally normal thing to do, you can include that in the bin, no problem. If you're composting in your backyard or your neighborhood bins, I would exclude cooked foods regardless of if you've cooked them with oil or not. So yeah, a little bit of oil, or you have leftover salad dressing that has a little bit of oil on it, totally fine to include in the bins. If you happen to have a giant jar of oil that has gone rancid, please do not dump that into the bin. That's where we say, no large amounts of oil or liquid.
And I was wondering off of that, what about like grease?
Like baking grease?
Yeah.
Or yeah, no baking grease, please.
Yeah, cool. Diane asks, are pine cones compostable?
Technically, yes, Diane, pine cones are compostable. They make much better peanut butter bird feeders at first. Then, there's a lot of uses for pine cones before composting them. I would include them in your home compost pile if you have one, but exclude them from the Rust Belt Riders system if you participate with us.
All right, so those are all the questions that have been submitted.
Cool.
Make sure you're getting those in there if you have anything just burning in your mind.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are, are there, I would love to ask everybody else a question, actually. If you are, how do I put it? If you are participating in this workshop, but you don't compost, can you raise your hand or drop a line in the chat? I would be really curious to know what's holding you back, or what you need to know to feel more comfortable participating. Or if you've heard from your friends about why you don't compost at home, in your neighborhood, wherever, with Rust Belt Riders, I'd be really curious to know, like, what do we think holds people back from participating the most?
Yeah, because I feel like if you're here, there's an interest. So how do we get you there?
Yeah, just really curious, right?
Yeah. In the meantime, I have a question from Laura. Do you need to sterilize the soil before you use it?
Laura, is that soil that you have made or that you've gotten from Rust Belt? Because no is the answer. Never in my time that I have made. Okay, thanks, Laura. No, I can't think of even how you would sterilize it except for putting it in like a steam chamber. I would just, think of something like what they used to, yeah, like putting it in a steam chamber, but I wouldn't do it. I've never done it. As long as there's no animal feces in your compost pile, if you haven't been, uh, putting your dog poo in your compost pile, I would say it's fine to use. If you are feeling trepidatious about it or some hesitation, you could put it on your garden and grow flowers in it the first year so that it has some more time to break down before you grow something like salad greens. That you have more chance of getting that soil in your mouth. But once it's had a year to break down, especially with other plants growing in it, you should be just fine. Though please know that while I do have 15 years of experience doing this, in no way am I a medical expert. So.
Sarah asked, or no, she didn't ask. She said that she adds compost to her mother-in-law's backyard compost bin, and she doesn't compost herself because it feels a little overwhelming. Very understandable.
Yeah, very understandable. It makes sense. There are like a huge number of ways to have a pile. You can, you know, just have this like sort of static pile where you just toss stuff and walk away from it, and it's gonna do the same for you. It's just sort of gonna sit there and maybe break down over a couple years. Excuse me. But if you put in the right materials, and you turn it and you give it a little attention and you give it some water, it's going to put out for you as well the same great care that you put in, only it will give you the form of care in the form of soil. We give it care in the form of material inputs. Nathan, our director of soil, names all of our compost piles because they are full of living organisms, and always, always, always greet your compost pile with a hearty hello before you start working with it.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
All right. Marilyn, I have a compost bin in my yard, but my village does not collect yard waste that is too large to put in a compost pile, and I hate putting it in with my garbage. What can I do? I've been wondering the same thing.
So your village does not collect yard waste that's too large to put in a compost pile, like giant branches. Is that how I would understand that? Yes. Great. Thanks, Marilyn. What can I do? If this, if
I
you have a
dry
gar,
and use them to start my grill.
yeah, great. You dry them and use them to start your grill. If you if you have thick branches and are feeling up to moving them around your yard, you can use them as borders around your gardens or flower beds. If you have a neighbor that so you like lay them and they're borders, and actually rotting wood is very, very, very beneficial to microorganisms in the soil. It provides like, you we may have all heard of nurse logs in a forest. So when a tree falls, other trees grow out of it. That's because it's a powerhouse of this really rich nutrients for other organisms, microorganisms, plants, all of it. So you could use those giant branches as borders for your garden. You could, if you have a neighbor or a friend or a landscaper who has a chainsaw, they could chop it up for you, and you could use those logs as key borders in your garden beds, or along the fence line. That's what I would recommend. It's not a great answer for I mean, it has its place, but it doesn't get to all the nuances of maybe having too much.
You could maybe solicit like a wood chipping company, see if, I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe
and
they'll come pick them up.
yeah, like a tree company. Now there's also so there's two ways to think about branches, right? There's a huge branch where it's, really, really, really thick, or there are like small branches with lots of little arms. There are small chippers, like there are like backyard chippers that you can rent from Handy Rents, or there's a tool, I think there's a tool rental company on the west side, but I definitely know there's a home resource repair center on the east side of town in the Cleveland Heights area, where you can rent a small chipper. It's like no bigger than a trash can. It's really smaller than a trash can, and you just feed small branches through there, and it gives you these really, what I would say, beautiful wood chips. Really nice size that you can mulch your garden with, you can mulch a tree with, you can add to your compost pile.
Just be careful.
Yeah, definitely. Read the instructions for use.
All right, we have about 5 more minutes. Does anyone have any last minute questions? Now's the time, but you can also always call. We'll answer your questions anytime.
Always.
I had a friend actually asked today about coffee filters and tea bags.
Yeah, those are completely acceptable both in a Rust Belt Rider system and in a backyard pile. They are a micro dose of carbon for your pile. Really little bit, just carbon. Even the bleached coffee filters are fine. We accept them in the Rust Belt Riders pile. And what I wanted to say is that there is one tea bag company, and I'm pretty sure that they come in triangular pouches, where those pouches are made of plastic. Those are not okay. Do not include plastic triangular tea bags in any compost pile. They're plastic. We already have enough microplastics in the world. Not for your compost pile.
For sure. Here's a question from Laura. Can you put cedar wood chips in the compost pile?
Laura, you can put cedar wood chips in your compost pile. You may, so cedar is a naturally, and I've had this, oh good, thanks Laura. Cedar is a naturally antimicrobial wood. So that's why it's used for animal bedding. Guinea pig shavings, rabbit shavings, horse bedding, that kind of thing. It depends on how the answer from me is yes. If somebody who is more of a purist was sitting next to me, they would say, no, absolutely not. Do not do that. As long as you are adding plenty of other inputs, both carbon and nitrogen, and turning your pile, it's going to be fine.
Wonderful. All right. And we had a comment from another Laura that said, I just want to say thank you. I use your drop-off service and absolutely love it. So thank you, Laura.
Good. Thank you. You bet. First, Laura Falk.
Awesome.
Yeah, if there's no other questions, we can hang out for a little bit in case folks do have questions. But I'm really grateful to have spent this last hour with you. I appreciate you joining for our discussion. We'll send out a link to the presentation, and my contact information is on this last slide. So if you ever need anything, just give a shout. And you're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining. You bet. We got 2 big thumbs up from this gal over here. Really one of my favorite topics to talk about. I also, and this is for anybody that wants to stay or go, no problem here, but I think that um, going back to that second or third slide that I had in the beginning where we said that the map is not the territory, I really think that's intimately true for everybody, where we can plan and set out, you know, what it can look like, and but it doesn't come to fruition until we actually try and practice and put it put it into practice in our lives, and start small and make mistakes and learn and get a little bigger and make mistakes and learn and explore that process over and over and over again. So I think just really want to put that one through. I only in the past like 3 years have I really figured out like what I really gotten it together to be a consistent food scrap collector for compost. I still put food in the trash sometimes too. I'm not perfect. Maybe that's how I should have started the workshop. Hey, everybody, don't worry.
Okay, Zoe, I'm gonna hop off too.
Okay, Claire, have a great night. Thank you. I'm
See you tomorrow.
gonna close this chat down here. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.